It's safe to say that the early part of the Second World War did not go well for the British Empire or its allies. But though defeats in Europe and the loss of France as an ally were serious disasters, the top of Britain's government remained in no doubt that the greatest threat to their survival and the continuation of the war was to be found at sea, in the form of the German U-boat submarines which for 4 long years would terrorise the Atlantic and threaten the suffocation of Britain's entire war effort. The Second World War was only hours old when the U-boat Menace began to show itself. On the evening of September 3, 1939, the passenger liner SS Athenia was mistaken for a warship, torpedoed and sunk by U-30 with the loss of 118 passengers and crew. This was followed swiftly by the losses of the aircraft carrier HMS Courageous on September 17th and battleship Royal Oak in an audacious raid on Scapa Flow a few weeks later. But the real danger to Britain was not the losses of these enormous capital ships, but the sinkings of increasing amounts of civilian merchant ships, more than 200 of them by the end of 1939. For Germany, the logic behind these attacks was brutally simple. Sink the merchant ships and you deprive Britain of the essential food and war material they carried. And if you sink the merchant ships faster than the Allies can replace them, eventually Britain would run out of ships entirely, severing the link to the US and its colonies and crippling its war effort. Keen to bring this about, Germany attacked merchant shipping with a variety of different weapons throughout the war, including aircraft, mines, disguised merchant raiders, and at various times the major surface ships of the Kriegsmarine itself, with mixed results. But overwhelmingly, the principal weapon in the war against Allied shipping was the submarine, which ultimately accounted for 68% of Allied shipping sunk during the war. In the early months of the war, the U-boat force under the leadership of Karl Dönitz found itself tasked to support the invasion of Norway, but after that campaign concluded, Dönitz's boats were released into the Atlantic. Their crews were delighted to find large amounts of Allied shipping sailing independently, as Britain struggled to fund enough convoy escorts to protect them all. As a result, it did not take long for losses to begin to mount. 140 ships, more than 500,000 tons of shipping was sunk in the Atlantic in June, as the U-boat offensive added to damage done by British coastal traffic by mines and aircraft. As summer turned to autumn, the U-boats grew bolder, for the first time beginning to coordinate their assaults, forming up as wolf packs to attack Allied convoys in nighttime surface attacks. One of the first major targets was the slow westbound convoy SC-7, which was mauled by a pack of U-boats led by Otto Kretschmer's U-99 over 3 days in October 1940, losing 20 of its 35 merchant ships. Shortly afterwards, the fast convoy HX-79 was similarly attacked, losing 12 out of 50 ships. These were terrible disasters for the Allies, exposing poorly coordinated escort ships, of which there weren't enough, an over-reliance on ASDIC sonar that could not detect a surface submarine, and merchant ships that were just too slow. By the end of the year, 3.6 million tons of Allied shipping had been sunk in the North Atlantic and the waters around Britain. This outstripped British merchant ship production by almost 3 million tons for the year, even before adding losses suffered elsewhere. It had been a brutal few months, and there was no let-up in the new year, with a new monthly record of 517,000 tons of shipping lost in March 1941. Firmly on the back foot then, the British scrambled to respond. New merchant shipping was ordered from the US, and as an escort stopgap, 50 old American vessels were procured in the Destroyers for Bases Agreement in September 1940. In British shipyards, dozens of Flower-class corvettes were under construction and would join the few that were already in service, but these would take time to build. And in the meantime, prodigious numbers of merchant ships continued to be sunk, with monthly losses still above 400,000 tons a month by June. The situation was dire. But for the second half of 1941, the Allies had 2 breakthroughs which eased the pressure. The first was the cracking of the German Naval Enigma Code for the first time in early 1941 by a team led by Alan Turing at Bletchley Park. This allowed the Allies to anticipate U-boat positions and route convoys around them for large parts of the rest of the war, You can avoid your own communications being compromised with today's sponsor, which is Surfshark VPN. Surfshark is a virtual private network, software that keeps you safe online by encrypting all of the information that your devices send and receive from the internet, keeping your data out of the hands of those with nefarious intentions. It disguises your IP address, making sure that your location remains private. Even to Surfshark, they themselves don't track or store anything about what you do online, giving you the maximum amount of privacy. Surfshark's VPN can be set to access the internet through servers almost anywhere in the world. This means that if you travel abroad, you can set your virtual location back home as if you never left. You can also use it to watch content online that's not available in your country, such as accessing the film Dunkirk on Australian Netflix, or watching this Historigraph video which has been blocked in most of Europe for the last 5 years. You can get 83% off plus 3 extra months by clicking the link in the description and using code Historigraph. And Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in trying it out. Thanks again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. The second major breakthrough for the Allies was the growing influence of the United States on the Atlantic, even as they remained formally at peace with the Axis. After winning re-election in November 1940, President Roosevelt implemented the Lend-Lease Act to make it easier for the British to obtain US supplies and approved the construction of a vast new class of merchantmen that would come to be known as the Liberty Ship. In April, the president went a step further and authorized the US Navy to play a more active role in protecting American trade to Britain, extending a security zone to 26 degrees west and occupying Iceland. As German U-boats were then operating as far west as 38 degrees, this brought American ships into potential conflict with the German U-boats. After the sinking of a US merchant vessel by a U-boat in May and an attack on the destroyer Greer in September, President Roosevelt issued a shoot-on-sight order, and the US Navy then began to directly escort Allied convoys through the western half of the Atlantic. This stretched the notion of neutrality to breaking point, and it did not take long for American ships to get caught up in the fighting. On October 17th, the destroyer Kearney was damaged during a battle with a U-boat, before 2 weeks later, while escorting convoy HX-156 near Iceland, the USS Reuben James was torpedoed and sunk, with the loss of 100 sailors. Despite this loss, the effect of the US's assertive protection of its trade, combined with gradually stronger British resources, was to make life much tougher for the U-boats, who found fewer lone merchant ships and struggled to continue their success in early 1941 for the rest of the year. Shipping losses in the Atlantic dropped dramatically, down to just 85,000 tons in November, at a time when the number of operational U-boats had almost quadrupled, from 22 in January to 80 by December. This was an important Allied success, preventing a costly 6 months from becoming a devastating year, but it still left Britain with a lot less shipping than before. Total tonnage lost during 1941 in the Atlantic was almost 3.3 million tons, again comfortably outstripping British production even before factoring in losses in other theatres, and it was about to get much worse. On December 10, 1941, Germany declared war on the United States in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack. For Admiral Donitz's U-boat campaign, this was fantastic news. Now his boats were free to range across the Atlantic, supported by new Type 14 fuel tanker submarines, to attack the vast amounts of American shipping sailing up and down its eastern seaboard and in the Caribbean. And unlike the increasingly difficult to attack Allied convoys in the mid-Atlantic, almost all of it was unescorted. Within weeks of war being declared, Donitz's boats unleashed a devastating wave of sinkings in the western Atlantic. Tonnage lost in January more than trebled from November, and by the spring more than 500,000 tons of merchant shipping was being lost in the Atlantic every month. The US Navy, under its new Commander-in-Chief Ernest King, struggled to get to grips with the problem, being slow to introduce convoys along their eastern coast and slow to provide adequate escort vessels and air cover, and so the sinkings continued, peaking at more than 650,000 tons of shipping losses in June, 7 times more than November 1941. At this point, President Roosevelt intervened and ordered the Navy to get its merchant shipping into convoy. They did this, and losses dropped sharply. But after 6 months of carnage, serious damage to the Allied war effort had been done nonetheless. For example, of crucial concern to the US was the transport of bauxite ore from British and Dutch Guiana, which was used to make the aluminium needed for aircraft production. According to the historian Phillips Payson O'Brien, General George Marshall, the US Army Chief of Staff, reported in mid-1942 that 22% of the US's bauxite transporting fleet was sunk between January and June. At around the same time, 1942 estimates for US aircraft production were revised downwards from 60,000 to 48,000 aircraft, a drop of 20%. O'Brien suggests that the German Navy could therefore be said to have destroyed 12,000 US aircraft by preventing them from being built in the first place. When you extrapolate this principle across all 6.1 million tons of shipping that was sunk in the Atlantic by the end of 1942, you end up with a huge amount of Allied guns, tanks, and aircraft that never make it to the front line in American, British, or Soviet hands. And the impact of the U-boats was not felt just in the direct losses of material through sunken ships, but also in the colossal response they provoked in the American war economy. Alarmed by the dangers of losing control of the Atlantic, President Roosevelt intervened to prioritize aircraft and naval escort forces, ordering in December 1942 that 462 escort vessels were to be built by the end of 1943. On top of this was the massive ongoing expansion in merchant ship construction, with nearly 1,000 ships scheduled to be added in 1943 alone as the Liberty ship program came to fruition. The resources for these enormous projects had to come from somewhere, and they came from other parts of the US's military buildup. According to O'Brien, the proportion of war production allocated for the Army dropped from 35% in January 1942 to 20% by December, with the planned size of the US Army's infantry force in 1943 cut by 40%. The German offensive in 1942 in the Atlantic had struck a powerful blow against the Allies, probably the most serious in the West since the fall of France in 1940. They had sunk huge amounts of war material and forced their opponents to devote a colossal amount of war production to counter the U-boats in a quest to regain the upper hand. With the ability of the US to build up strength in Europe and supply Britain and the Soviet Union with crucial war material at stake, it was a battle the Allies could not afford to lose. Over the next 12 months, they would make sure they didn't. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next video story of just how they turned it around.